something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to American Exception. I'm Aaron Good. This is the excerpted first portion of a full episode of the American Exception podcast. If you would like to view or listen to the rest of the episode, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have hundreds of episodes available for subscribers. If you want to better understand the deep politics and history of the U.S. empire, American Exception is the best place to go. The URL is patreon.com/AmericanException. Subscribe if you can, and either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel.
Asa Winstanley, it's great to have you back.
It's great to be back, Aaron. Appreciate it.
And Jim DeBrosse, you're here for the first time, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And the two of you have written an article. This is you're the author on it, but you had research assistance from Asa. So Jim, you're the lead author of the article over at Electronic Intifada. Israel was part of the conspiracy to kill JFK. And I was very pleased to see this because I've been writing about this subject and doing many podcasts about it. The issue of the Israeli involvement and Zionist involvement in the JFK assassination. So, Jim, what was it that compelled you in particular to write this article? Because it's something that the JFK assassination research community, if you can call it a community, they don't really get along well, but it's a subject that, as you noted in the article, is taboo and under researched. So what is it that made you go into this taboo area?
Well, after the Israeli response to the October 7th Hamas assault, I mean, I just saw that, the whole idea was basically to eradicate the Palestinians and move them to another country. And I couldn't understand why the media, didn't understand or see that. So I started writing a book about our relations with Israel and how often we have been betrayed by them. And this was part of that book. I don't want to go into all the other stuff, but of course I could not find a publisher. And then a friend of mine said, well, why don't you break the book apart and see if you can freelance parts of it, to different organizations. And fortunately, ASA and Electronic Intifada were very open to publishing it.
Yeah, well, I have to give some, actually, we have to give some credit to you, Aaron, actually, for this, because we, especially my colleague Maureen Murphy, senior editor at Electronic Intifada, are listeners of the American Exception, and it has to be said that this topic is not like a typical topic for me in particular. Like the JFK assassination was kind of a new area of research for me, and really your work kind of opened my eyes a bit to this area, whereas maybe 10 years ago, if I'd come across this article, Jim, from you being submitted, I would have thought, no, sounds a bit too crazy. But like with everything we've learned about the JFK assassination, especially in the last few years, you have to face certain realities. I mean, like it's astonishing stuff, really. Like, I mean, I summed it up on our Electronic Intifada live stream last week. We did like a quick promo for the article, and the way I just put it for new readers and listeners who maybe who haven't even seen the JFK film by Oliver Stone, which I think is a great film. The way I put it was simply this: in the 1960s and the 1970s, there were two investigations into the assassination of JFK. The first one in the 1960s said that there was no conspiracy, that there was a lone gunman, who acted alone and just one day decided to kill JFK for no particular reason that can be discerned, right?
And then he was killed by another one.
Yeah, and he was also then completely killed by another assassin, who turns out to be a mobster. The second investigation said, well, there was quite a probable conspiracy, but we can't identify the members of this conspiracy. So, it's what's really kind of encouraging to me, and I was only vaguely aware of it, is this, almost community, or like, although as you said, Aaron, they don't necessarily always get along all the time, but this, let's say, ecosystem of JFK researchers who are out there, mostly amateur, has to be said, putting time and resources and passion into unearthing all this research. And like when obviously at the Electronic Intifada, every article that we published is thoroughly fact checked. But this piece, because it was long piece for one thing, because Jim's piece was so long, and because it sounds kind of out there, right? On the surface of it, if you're not familiar with the topic, we kind of extra fact checked it, and every time I fact checked it, I was surprised, or at least I was struck by the amount of information that is out there. It takes some digging to get to, but the sources are all out there. You can dig into this stuff and you can find it there. And it is so thoroughly, like just one small example, I'm sure you'll get into it, Aaron, but the issue of Jack Ruby, of who Jack Ruby, born Jack Rubenstein was, there was like in one of the commissions, I think it was the House Select Committee, maybe in the Warren Commission, I forget, but there was a long backstory of his whole life story just there, just very, very, and then you can reference it, and it's all up there on official American government websites. So, there's so many resources that you can access, but at the same time, a lot of this is very buried.
Right, and of course the House Select Committee was defunded before it could finish its investigation. So, yeah, it's been very, very frustrating. Asa and I went back and forth a little bit on how we should headline this article, and I finally, should we make it more of a question? Was Israel involved in the conspiracy? And finally, I just said it's time to pull the trigger. There is just so much smoke. And that there has to be a fire. In addition to all the information that's out there that Asa said, there's a ton of misinformation and missing information. It's a rabbit hole. The brain is missing, the casket is missing, the car was cleaned up, before anybody could even do an investigation. The original autopsy report was destroyed. It just goes on, and yet we're supposed to believe the Warren Commission's report that it was just some lone gunman, who wanted fame.
Right. Yeah, I am with you in a similar position as both of you, in terms of when I first started to look at this issue, there was some resistance or some reason that I hadn't beforehand. Even though I'd read, I think that one of the best books for this, even though it doesn't make the case explicitly, is Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, because the Peter Dale Scott book that came out in 1993, because it covers the Lansky mob, and you see, and he gets into why does the head of the House Select Committee, Robert Blakey, what are the politics behind him putting out this false version of an Italian mafia the way that he does and describing it this way? And that, when you look at Ruby that way, with that in mind, and aware that I am, because I did an oral history with Peter where I recorded hours and hours of episodes, and I just kept asking him these things about it, and finally he came to admit that, like, look, I don't talk about Israel, and I talked to him more about this, and he said it was because he'd gotten death threats in the past. So a lot of the things that he's written, Israel plays a bigger role, and yet it was one he wouldn't discuss. And that possibility that Peter would, because Peter is such a guru when it comes to these things. He's written about these subjects more than anyone, and it didn't occur to me when I was writing my dissertation or anything else that he would be just not talking about something that was a major part of the stories he was discussing. And then I found that it was, and that blew my mind. And then I went back and looked at these things in a different way, especially Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. I looked at that closely, and it was just mind-blowing. The Ruby stuff alone in that book is just mind-blowing. He worked at the Santa Anita racetrack, for Christ's sakes. That's the same place where Sirhan worked for a little while. Sirhan, right?
I didn't know that.
And he was Jack Ruby was involved in two crucial murders for the crime syndicate. One of them was the 1939 murder of Leon Cook, which marked the beginning of the mob. He was in the room for this murder. It was a union. He was a low-level union boss, and that murder was written about in RFK's Enemy Within as the moment at which the Teamsters pension fund got taken over by the mob. Okay, and in 1946, James Reagan was murdered, and this over the wire service, the National Wire Service, which was the sort of nationwide gambling network that you would have bribes in every city because of the wire service, so you'd know who won the horse races, et cetera, et cetera. And that's probably why Bugsy Siegel was really killed, was because of the wire service. And Peter writes this in Deep Politics. And this led to the consolidation of the wire service gave the syndicate a whole lot of power, because you could control the gambling corruption in every town, which would give you a foothold into corrupting the rest of the city, the rest of the city's political leadership. Once you have people taking bribes for this, you've kind of got them for everything else. And he was murdered. This guy, James Reagan, was murdered by two associates of Jack Ruby. So it's really this Lansky thing, this issue of Lansky and the crime syndicate and its ties to the intelligence apparatus, because Lansky was protected by Anslinger of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the top guy. He's protected by J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, and he was protected by James Angleton at different points. So it's just a mind-blowing thing.
Yeah, I would agree. Scott's book was pivotal, and it certainly made an impression on me. I actually had a chance to meet him at a JFK conference in San Francisco, and just a really modest but brilliant man. But I think the really powerful thing about the book is how he made clear how counterintelligence people in countries all over the world, specifically the U.S. and Israel, work with gangsters to do their dirty work. And in return, these these counterintelligence agencies protect the gangsters. And they know no but laws. Their laws mean nothing to them. International boundaries mean nothing to them. And you bring up a brilliant point about Ruby, but Seth Cantor, who was a Scripps Howard reporter here in the States, wrote years ago about Ruby's role in this whole thing, and he swore and put it in his book that he saw Ruby in the Parkland Hospital the day after Kennedy was shot, and he was down in the morgue area where they just so happened to find the miraculous bullet that supposedly, went through Kennedy and into Connolly and caused 7 wounds and somehow ended up being pristine. The magic bullet, exactly. And what's really interesting is Blakey discounted all that. Oh, you can't, you misidentified it. Later, after the investigation, he admitted that Seth Cantor was probably right. Ruby was there in the hospital.
Right. Yeah, and another guy who was well respected. I mean, he became a sort of famous lawyer. I think you mentioned him in the article, Louis Kuttner. It later turned out he had connections to intelligence and was involved in things like the Fred Hampton assassination, if I'm recalling this correctly.
Really?
But he actually told he told the reporters, it was written up in the paper, that Jack Ruby was a syndicate lieutenant, and that he had testified, and that Kuttner had represented him during the Kefauver Committee hearings, and that Ruby was offered information on Chicago as long as they promised not to go after Dallas. And they just somehow memory hold this or ignored it or said we don't believe him or whatever. But this was known that he was a syndicate, and I think that's about right, a syndicate lieutenant. Like he, as Peter describes in Deep Politics and Death of JFK, he seems to have controlled the fix with the authorities. So if you needed to get drugs through Dallas or something like that, you had to check with Ruby. And
this is a sort of a side note, but Scott invented the term deep state. And of course, it's been co-opted by Trump and all the others as well. The deep state is after us. But yeah, it's true. It operates beneath the transparency and rule of law and openness of government. It is a deep state.
And Lansky said the syndicate is bigger than U.S. Steel.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really liked about your piece, Jim, was how you brought out the involvement of organised crime and the kind of meshing of organised crime with the US deep state. And the new aspect, of course, was the connection to Israel. I mean, and that's really what you get into in the article. Although I think there's a lot more to be discovered about it, a lot more that's still hidden, and we've kind of got hints about it. Although there's some definitely proven links there, and we get you get into them in the piece. But it's really interesting to me. Like I mentioned this, the JFK researchers, and of course there's a whole kind of cottage industry of. I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of JFK books JFK assassination books specifically have been released over the years. It must be very many, but there's a whole subgenre of them which are dedicated to showing that it was done by the mob, that it was done by the Mafia, right? And as you said, this is something that Peter Dale Scott talks about, and that and you mentioned, Jim, the kind of disinformation that's out there, and I think an aspect of that narrative, although it's not untrue that the mob was involved, of course that's true, but the idea that it was just the Mafia. It wasn't, and quite often that is kind of weaponized as a way to divert attention from the deep state, from the CIA, and now, as we know more, from Israel, because it's a kind of diversionary tactic and ignoring this simple, proven and admitted fact that, especially since World War II, the CIA, its predecessor, the OSS, and other U.S. intelligence agencies have worked hand in glove with organized crime.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, James Angleton, who a lot of people, the CIA super spooker, head of counterintelligence and liaison to Mossad, who everybody thinks was at the very center of the conspiracy, he first started using organized crime right after the war in order to go after the Sicilian communists and the Italian communists. The roots are very, very deep. Scott is just amazing in how he puts all the pieces together. Because really, if you think of it, it was organized like the Manhattan Project. You had all these individual players like the mob, the OAS, but you needed somebody at the top who had the big picture and could pull the strings. The people at the bottom, most of them didn't know how the whole thing was put together. And that's how you make a conspiracy work. I don't think the mob was big enough or smart enough to have pulled it off on their own, and they needed protection, and the protection came through the CIA.
Yes, and the CIA, and there's one other aspect of this that I think if you look at Peter's work, you'll start to discern a little bit more. And so there's 2 points before I get into the specifics of your article that I want to bring up. One of them is that Peter wrote 2 books about the JFK assassination that essentially got disappeared. You can't find them. One of them was in the early 70s. One of them was called maybe Beyond Conspiracy, and the other one might have been the Dallas Conspiracy, something to that effect. But the point is, they were both disappeared. And my friend and colleague Max Arvo, who's done fantastic research on this, he's been my partner in some of this. He found one of these books, the manuscript of it, and Peter had written in the margins something that he wanted to add. He wrote that if, as it appears, Israel played an instrumental role in the assassination, they wouldn't have done so without the sanction of a higher authority in the U.S. because it would have been suicidal, at this point, given the situation of Israel and the U.S., it wasn't quite like it is today. It was different, right?
That's
he
fascinating.
Wrote this. Yeah, he wrote this, and it's fascinating that he wrote it, fascinating that he didn't return to it in his later books, and that those books themselves got disappeared, which I don't really know that happening to other prominent JFK researchers. And his notes, his papers were destroyed when there was a fire that burned down, which is
really
strange to me. Now even stranger. And the other point I wanted to make was, when they wanted to surveil the U.S. government, the CIA, Mike Pompeo, when they wanted to surveil Julian Assange, and even they plotted his assassination, they didn't just have the CIA do this. They actually outsourced it to the Sands Casino, the Adelson outfit, the security outfit for that. And the Sands Casino is literally a Lansky joint. So
right.
Even all these years later, they want someone killed. They still essentially turn. I mean, does anybody have any doubt about Adelson's connections to Israeli intelligence, et cetera, et cetera? It's like they still have that relationship apparently operant in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because on Monday, for my sins, I watched the Trump speech in the Knesset, the whole hour-long speech. I have to admit, it was quite fun to watch because it was sort of a rambling train of thought. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was also psychopathic because he was devoted to Israel. But the best part of it was when Miriam Adelson, Sheldon Adelson's widow and inheritor of his empire, she was in the Knesset and he told her just to stand up. And, he said, look at her sitting there so innocently. She's got $60 billion in the bank.
Yeah.
And he basically said that the reason I moved the US embassy to Israel, to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, was because of the Adelsons. They used to come to our office all the time. And he said the reason that, I recognized the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights was because of the Adelsons. I mean, it was just, this is the thing about Trump. He says things more frankly than other presidents would. I have to say Adelson looked a bit uncomfortable.
Well, the Sands Casino was also the site of a secret meeting. I forget what year. It was probably in the early 2000s among pro-Israeli supporters in the U.S. and Adelson on what to do about the BDS movement in America. They were really threatened by it. They put together a ton of money and went to work. And now there are 37 states in America that ban BDS boycotts. If you're not familiar with that, that's the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, trying to pressure Israel into coming to the peace table. And the same tactic was used against South Africa with great success in the 80s and 90s, but it has never gotten off the ground here. And what's really interesting is the Supreme Court has yet to rule. I mean, this is an obvious First Amendment issue, and that was established years ago, that boycotting is a form of free speech. But we have 37 states that outlaw it. But anyway, I'm absolutely. There are a few things in my life I'll die for: my family and my best friends, and the First Amendment.
I mean, it is frightening the way it's under attack now. It seems to be the one thing that you could say, like, well, at least in the United States, you can kind of say, most things, even if you can't have a platform for it, you can at least say them. But now we wonder when they're going to start killing more people or arresting them, or the methods of assassination are going to become more sophisticated. These people are sort of cornered at this point, I think, by historical forces. And how much violence are they going to unleash, and how much repression are we going to see is the question that we're all kind of living with.
Scary as hell.
But, Aaron, because that's really fascinating what you mentioned about Peter Dale Scott's disappeared out-of-print books about the assassination, earlier books. And this manuscript with the marginal mention of Israel, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd love to learn more about that. But it reminds me of there was a bit of a rabbit hole that I went down when I was assisting Jim with this piece, and one of the sources cited in Jim's article is this book, Coup d'etat in America, from the CIA and the Assassination of John F. Kennedy from 1975, and it's by a late journalist, Michael Canfield, and Alan J. Weberman, who is a very strange and unusual character.
Yes.
Who I did a bit of research into, and I found out some really strange stuff. He's made some very strange claims, although by all accounts this book that I've only read parts of, some of his claims are contested, but it was a very well regarded book at the time, and it seems to have been one of the reasons for the foundation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about that. I know they drew heavily from the research and documents on that from that committee.
Yeah.
But
that was a weird committee, when they made the one guy resign, Sprague. The two guys that they sought a couple of people to replace him, and the second one accepted. But the one guy that they had, the first guy they approached was Arthur Goldberg to take over the investigation. And Arthur Goldberg was a huge Zionist. Like, he had been a Supreme Court justice who stepped down to become the UN ambassador right on the eve of the 6-Day War. And so at the UN, you had a dedicated Zionist during the 6-Day War as the UN ambassador. And really, stepping down from the Supreme Court to be UN ambassador is a demotion. It's very strange that you would do that. But they asked, why would you do that right at that time? And it's just perfect. I mean, he was, and Goldberg turned that job down. And the guy that they picked, Blakey, he at one point, as much as he's the Mafia guy, the organized crime guy, well, he had represented Mo Dalitz as a lawyer in a libel suit saying Mo Dalitz wasn't a gangster. You're libeling him. So even Blakey has these strange connections to this. It's a very bizarre case, the way that they were using that. And the other important guy, Bernard Finsterwald, I mean, he's very, very weird. He was former naval intelligence. He had connections to the Teamsters. He had represented this senator, I think, not Russell Long, but maybe Edward Long from Missouri, who went down because of Teamster corruption. And, of course, Bernard Finsterwald becomes the lawyer of James McCord during Watergate. When McCord makes the decision to go after the president, he switches lawyers, and he picks Finsterwald, of all people. And this is, and Peter Del Scott back in the 70s knew Finsterwald, and he was in Finsterwald's office and saw him with James McCord.
Wow.
Which blew my mind to learn. So,
if I could bring up, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but go ahead.
Can I just make a quick point about just to finish what I was saying about A.J. Weberman? One of I found out in the course of this, like, one of the claims, I mean, who knows how reliable this is, but one of the claims that A.J. Weberman made on one of his websites some years ago was that he had known Jim Garrison in the 1970s, of course, who famously was the only person to prosecute anyone for the actual for the conspiracy to assassinate JFK. And according to Weberman, Garrison sought his help in getting trying to get a manuscript published, and according to Weberman, the manuscript was blamed the Mossad for the assassination, and of course that manuscript has never seen the light of day. There's no mention of Israel in Garrison's book on the Trail of the Assassins. No direct mention anyway, but yeah. So I mean, I don't know if that's true, but that because A.J. Weberman does claim some strange things. He's an ultra Zionist for one thing, a very hard right Zionist, but that's kind of very tantalizing possibility.
Well, the impressive thing about Garrison is he was the first and perhaps only investigator to follow the money. He heard from an informant that Clay Shaw had been seen in the company of both Ruby and David Ferry, New Orleans, several months before the assassination. What gives with that, But of course, he was totally discredited as being, a narcissist, fraudulent, etc. And poor Clay Shaw, he was just an innocent businessman, being martyred. Well, it turns out he was working for the CIA. We found that out later.
But even when that was found out, they still play it down to this day. They're like, oh, well, he just, it was just informal advice of a businessman. It's like, come on, really?
Yeah.
You believe this?
Yeah. Yeah, Jim Garrison did say, because Jim DiEugenio told me this, and there's a 1975 interview with Garrison, so this is at a key time. The House Select Committee is gearing up, or the Church Committee, and then that leads to the House Committee. But he said that JFK was murdered, and the conspirators were elements of the CIA, elements of the Pentagon, and the Lansky segment of the crime syndicate.
Yeah, well, Jim DiEugenio, and I have some respect for the guy. I think he's a good researcher. He won't touch the Israeli connection to the assassination, and I know that because I went on his radio show and interviewed me about my book, and he basically in the transcript excised everything I had said about the possible Israeli connection. So, I think there are a lot of researchers out there that they're sort of pecking around the edges. We got to get factual information, but they're not getting to the heart of the thing. Who had the means? Who had the motive to make this happen? And nobody, and who had the money? And nobody wants to go after that. Before I forget, I wanted to make a point, though. I'm sorry, and I interrupted you guys a couple times with this, and I apologize. But one of the reasons I think Peter Dale Scott's early books disappeared is because Berkeley Press, which had published those, Peter told me they were under tremendous criticism after that, and I don't doubt for a second that they took they quit printing it, took it off the market or whatever. He said that Berkeley was never interested in another of his books after that.
He did do the Road to 9/11, but I don't think these were published by Berkeley. I could be wrong about that, but I think they were published by other sources. But you're right that it's amazing that he even got any of those books published by UC Berkeley, Berkeley Press. So let's talk about some aspects of the article that you write about. Here, because this subject is so Byzantine, and we could go on forever about these issues. I think that I know Jim DiEugenio also. I'll just say this about him, and he is starting to write about JFK and Israel more and his policy.
Okay, all right. Well, more power to him.
There were people for a long time in this community. There's this Michael Collins Piper guy, and he is connected to such shady, basically Nazi-type people, and I personally think, and I always avoided the book because of problems with the scholarship, and he cites some really dubious people. It kind of discredits itself. I now think that that's probably what the book was supposed to do, that some people, whether he was sincere or not, it's one of those things where you get out in front of something and you basically shit code it. You cover the story, and shit is the term for it, because it makes it radioactive. Because
he said some things were blatant
research, basically.
Yeah, I don't
research, but then he takes it and adds some other crazy shit to it.
Right. No, I agree. I think he did his homework, but there are some blatantly anti-Semitic remarks in the book. It's overwritten. I mean, he badly needed an editor like Asa to go over it. But it was groundbreaking, and I'll have to admit, it was one of the first books I started reading when I started on my dissertation in grad school, which led to my book. I mean, I was 60 years old, and I 61 or 62. I had to come up with a topic for my journalism dissertation, and a close friend of mine said, what about all these people attacking Oliver Stone's movie? Why don't you write about that? Great.
Yeah, because he was attacked by the media like nothing I've ever seen. So your document, your article, you obviously focus on James Angleton. So why don't you summarize the key information about Angleton that links him to the assassination and to JFK, which I know that's a tricky thing to try to do in a few minutes. But Angleton, we have talked about him on this podcast a bit. I've done interviews with Jeff Morley about him, and we go into him in depth. So, but he's such a key figure. What is it about him that made you focus on him from the start?
Well, I mean, it wasn't just, I mean, I am riding on the shoulders of many others, but he was in a key position to pull all the strings in the assassination. He was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA, the dirty tricks part of it. He seldom cooperated with other people at the CIA. He closely guarded all his information, and especially his connections to Mossad. He was the liaison between CIA and Mossad, and he never, ever discussed that with other people. And as a matter of fact, I put it in the article that he told the CIA historian, my records on Mossad are off limits, and they've never been, I'm sure they'll never see the light of day. But, you know, he had the connections to the mob going back to, you know, post-World War II in Italy. You know, he had the connections to Mossad. I mean, he would use Mossad agents almost interchangeably with CIA agents to get stuff done, for instance, including spying on Castro after the Bay of Pigs. He would have lunch with, you know, his buddies in the Mossad at his favorite restaurant. So, you know, and not only that, he ended up he was the chief person protecting Israel's nuclear program from JFK. He totally hit it. And JFK, here he was trying to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, which, of course, we know today is, you know, forget about it. It's not going to happen. But he did try in those early days to keep Israel from getting a bomb because, you know, the Middle East situation was just crazy. It's still crazy. And, of course, Israel now is the only country that has nuclear weapons in the region. Anywhere from 90 to 400 are the estimates. And they still don't talk about it. They still don't admit it. And no one in Washington, D.C. will admit it, that they have nuclear weapons. So, you know, here we are, you know, and here's Israel always playing, you know, the poor little victim surrounded by enemies. When they've got 400 nukes, you know, they can turn on anybody.
For access to the rest of this episode and the rest of our vast and growing library, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I also want to express my deep appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers on Patreon. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. American Exception exists thanks to our Patreon subscribers. On YouTube, we will never be viable. You may notice that we have dropped the Devil's Chess Club title from these episodes. After David Talbot had to leave our team due to his second, more debilitating stroke, I kept the Devil's Chess Club name and theme song and intro. I didn't want to close the book on David's partnership with Bryce and me. I had hopes that he would return. David and I had planned to write 2 books together after 2024, one on the ultra-Zionist neocon takeover of U.S. foreign policy, and another on the RFK assassination. It now seems very unlikely that David will return to podcasting or to writing. As such, it didn't make sense to keep using the Devil's Chess Club brand. Still, to pay homage to David and the outstanding books that David wrote with his wonderful research assistant, Karen Croft, we're going to keep using the Devil's Chess Club theme song intro for our video episodes. David, if you're listening, know that we miss you very much. Finally, and again, please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe so that American Exception can continue to mind the darkness.